Yeah, I mean, I would say I work as an illustrator, comic book artist, and an educator. I teach at VCU
Yes.
in the communication arts department. Well, when they brought me into the department, it was to primarily teach comic books. I teach kids not about the history of comics, but to teach kids how to make comics. But because I'm an illustrator and have been, an illustrator for 40 years now, I also teach the occasional illustration class. But my main focus is comics. I mean, I was really into comics and cartoons. So I'm considerably older than you are. And so when I was a kid, they had reruns of all of the classic cartoons from the 30s and 40s, like Warner Brothers, Terry Toons, the Fleischer Brothers. I love those cartoons, and anytime I could get my hands on a comic book, and as far back as I can remember, like 5 years old, I just always liked comics, and it was one of those things. I mean, I always drew, and I think one of the reasons as I got older that my interest in comics was sustained was because I didn't know it at the time, but I'm very dyslexic, and so reading text was difficult, like reading novels and that kind of a page full of dense text was really hard. And comics was just something that, I did like to read, but it was really a struggle. And being that I like to draw, I mean, comics were just kind of, the natural default. I copied comics all the time, and it's funny because I was sort of self-taught initially by just copying comics and not understanding what I was doing. When I would, on occasion, do like an observational drawing, it always looked like a comic. and my very first figure drawing class, when I was a freshman, the drawings looked like figures from comic books, and I was like, "Yeah, look at this! Doesn't this look great?" And then, like looking back, it's like, "Wow, that was." I mean, it was a really hard thing to shake.
Yeah.
And it still is. I mean, if I'm drawing something that I want it to look a little more realistic, a little more representational, I have to sort of
really
put
think about it.
put my comic book instincts to the side. Well, it didn't really start until I went to college, because up until then it was all just self-taught. And I mean, I had a really good friend who, when I was in high school, actually I had a couple, but there was one in particular that, we were all comic book nerds, and we would get together and do things we probably weren't supposed to do, and then draw, just hang out, listen to music and draw. And he was much better at it than I was at the time, but it was just like, I just found a like-minded group of people, and we just sort of, it's like, having an unofficial club.
Yeah.
And then my other art, I guess art training, formal art training, would have been at VCU. And it's when I was at VCU, it was obviously pre-internet, pre-computer.
Yes.
And so it was a lot harder to access information. And now that I'm teaching, it's amazing the amount of really helpful tutorials out there, literally at your fingertips. And there's so many things that if a student's curious and wants to learn, there's so many things that they can learn in such a shorter period of time. And I mean, it's not the same as working with a teacher, but you can really lay down a pretty solid base, if you're really curious and want to just, take it on yourself. And like I've been teaching at Com Arts now, like for 8 years or so. And just initially, I think a lot of teachers were apprehensive about relying on the internet, and they felt like, it was like a cheat and in a way it kind of was, but also they've been embracing it much more readily. Because like I'm not naturally a social person, which I think is kind of why I do what I do. And so my illustration work was just kind of slowing down, and I had to do something. And so it was like around 50 that in Jessie, my wife, strongly encouraged me to pursue teaching. And I do have an MFA, and so that was one of the things that made the teaching a lot easier.
Yeah.
And so just sort of as a last ditch, desperate thing on my part, I approached VCU and asked them about teaching. And the crazy thing is, I had never taught a day in my life. I had no idea how to do it. And they just threw me into some classes. It was kind of like sink or swim.
Yeah, wow.
Yeah, which was, pretty disorienting.
Yeah, an adjustment, I'm assuming.
Yeah, and the first year was pretty rough, and I didn't do a very good job. And but then I ended up, oddly enough, getting hired to teach fashion illustration through Kim Guthrie. And Kim and one of the women that she teaches with, Christine, actually were my mentors, and really kind of like helped me learn how to teach.
Yeah.
And sort of taught me what I needed to know. And then as I got into comm arts, so I did like a year in comm arts, and then they didn't invite me back.
Oh no.
Which it wasn't terribly surprising. And so then Kim invited me into the fashion program, and then like 2 years later, the chair changed in comm arts, and I was the people I knew there just were like, you want to teach the comic book class? So I was like, yeah. No. So I was sort of brought back in.
Yeah.
So it was like, for me, I was learning to teach as I was teaching.
Yeah.
And I mean, I feel like it's crazy. I wish I'd started earlier, but maybe I wouldn't have been as in the right headspace to do it, because I actually really like teaching.
Yeah.
And it's something that I think that it's oddly as antisocial as I can be. It's something that I actually think I'm pretty good at. Well, I mean, I think like over time, your influences change, and they sort of evolve as you evolve. So like as a little kid, I guess it was like junior high school is when I really started to focus on the creators. And there were these guys, Mike Kaluta and Bernie Wrightson, who, were doing these sort of fantasy/horror comics, and I was really into that stuff. And then, and actually I got to meet some of them, and they turned me on to some older, sort of classic illustrators. And I slowly began to sort of expand my worldview. And then coming to VCU, and having to take art history classes,
Yeah.
It really sort of opened up everything. And then I learned much more about contemporary illustration. I learned much more about painters and the history of painting. So it's just been a really slow, it's like an ongoing thing.
Yeah.
And like the crazy thing is, so way back when, pre-internet, you really had sort of a narrow exposure to the artists that were sort of allowed into the museums, the galleries, illustration by the gatekeepers, and so you always kind of thought these are the only people who are worthy of exposure. And then with the advent of the internet, suddenly everybody could get their work out there.
Yeah.
And there's so much more amazing work out there than you could ever have imagined. And so it's like, I mean, I literally stumble upon new people all the time. I'm
Yeah.
kind of like, wow, where did this person come from?
Yeah, definitely.
So it's kind of, I don't, at this point in time, I don't really have a main inspiration, because it's sort of an embarrassment of riches in terms of how many are out there.
Yeah.
I mean, the thing for me, so once upon a time, so when I was in graduate school, and this was just before the computer and the internet thing exploded, I was very much influenced and inspired by the older traditional approach to editorial illustration. And so I was drawing with pencil and painting with oils, and which was kind of going against all of the comic book influences up to that point. And it was also really time intensive. But pre-internet, you would have deadlines that were more generous, and so you could actually spend sometimes a week or two on a painting. Whereas today, you don't have that so much. Magazines aren't really that vital. It's usually blogs or digital magazines,
Yeah.
and so they usually want things like the next day or that day. And I think that the illustration that you see now, it's really evident that the deadlines are so unforgiving.
Yeah, I've never really thought about that.
And like in terms of like so one, I did sort of a traditional approach for about 10 years, and then Jessie, my wife, introduced me to Photoshop.
Oh wow.
And it was like, oh wow, I can do comics, like really, I can embrace my old comic book sensibility much easier and much more readily. And I was just like, I thought it was really cool. So I decided and also it was faster. So, you could do more work faster, quicker, and make more money.
Yeah.
And so I sort of just threw my painting and traditional drawing out the window and started doing illustration that was enhanced by Photoshop, which was much more comic book oriented. So these days, my style is a little bit, it's a weird amalgam of comics and my oldest style of illustration.
Yeah.
It's just sort of evolved into, its own kind of thing. So I don't really have a favorite.
Yeah.
And I mean, I've done so many things that, it's hard to say. It's kind of like asking me who my favorite kid is. Well, and again, it's changed, right? Because of technology. In the past, is what you would do is you would put together an actual physical portfolio. And if you were in New York, you would call art directors. As what I would do, I would go to the newsstand. I would go through the magazines I liked. I would see who the art director was, and I would get their phone number.
Oh, wow.
And I would write down their address, or do both. And then you mail them little like postcards if you work, or tear sheets, and you would call them, you pester them, and see if they would take a look at your portfolio. And if they saw your work in print, sometimes they would call you and ask you to do work for them. But it was like a little bit of both of those things. And then these days, I mean, it's I recently got a job from somebody I worked with like 30 years ago. I hadn't worked with them since. And I was posting some work I was doing on Facebook. She saw it, and she called me and was like, "Oh, do you want to do something for me, sort of along the line of what you've been posting?" So posting this stuff on Facebook, I wasn't doing it with the intent of getting work. I was just showing off.
Yeah.
So these days, once upon a time, it was sort of, you had to be industrious, and you had to collect, names and phone numbers and addresses. And it, once your work started to see print, then it kind of, art directors talked amongst themselves, and it was kind of an organic thing, and it still is, but it's just enhanced by, the internet.
Yeah.
And like sending emails and that kind of thing. Yeah, so that was like, some illustrators that I sort of knew indirectly. Well, actually, and I guess this was right around the time I started to get into VCU. But like Sterling Humling, who teaches at VCU, and Robert McGank, who was the chair of the department for a little while, they had both done one. And I've always loved music. I used to do posters for local bands when I was in college, and I always thought that would be such a fun gig to have. But I just didn't think I was in the right network to get it. And I think it was Steve Lepke, who works for Adventure Richmond, called me and asked me, and I was like, yes, I would love to do it.
Definitely.
Yeah. And it actually paid pretty well, because a lot of times those kinds of gigs, it's like, well, it's going to be great
Everybody's
exposure.
gonna see it.
And it actually paid pretty well for what it is. And it was a lot of fun. I mean, they were like, in terms of the parameters, it's like, okay, it has to say the folk festival, it has to have the dates. It has to be about music, but it can't be about a specific genre, because it's such a wide variety of musicians that play, which was kind of like, okay. So suddenly I had these constraints that were really interesting, and I had to figure out what I could do to depict music that was void of any kind of specific genre. And then the other thing is I had to design, one of the designs had to incorporate all of the bands.
Yeah,
which was like
definitely a challenge.
Which was a huge challenge. And so designing the illustration with that in mind, and knowing that I was going to do, one was going to be a version of it with all the band names, and one was going to be a print without the band names. It's going to be sort of a fine art print.
Yeah.
And so but that was an interesting challenge, because a lot of times editorial illustration, if it's usually they give you a manuscript, and you have to do something that is directly related to supporting the idea that whatever you view as the main idea of the manuscript, you try to distill it into like a really simple idea. And there's a lot of back and forth with the art directors or editors, whereas with this, I was, they told me those things that I mentioned, and they're like, do a couple of sketches. So I did 2 or 3 different sketches, and they picked one, and they're like, okay, we like this, but could you add this? Could you add that? And I was like, yeah, I can do that, to make it more Richmond centric.
Yeah.
And but they were really easy to work with.
Okay.
It was actually a really fun job. Generally what I'll do is I work initially, for whatever job you do, you have to submit thumbnails, which are really quick sketches.
Yeah.
and they usually want, you know, 3 or 4, and so I usually do 3, and ideally, hopefully the art director will select one of those, or select one that's with minor variations or minor revisions, and then you take that pencil drawing and you do a bigger, more refined, you know, a complete version of it, and then you send that to the art director, and they have to make sure that everything's, you know, how they want it, and then I take it and I ink it, so I do that all analog, and then I scan that into the computer, and then I just, you know, do the coloring and the shaded and everything using Photoshop. So yeah, you just you know, flatten it into a JPEG, and you know, whatever the proportion is, excuse me, for that they're going to print it, because normally when I work up larger than it's going to be printed, but when I send it to the art director, I have to size it down and just send it as a flattened JPEG or PNG or a TIFF, and then, you know, they do with it what they will.
Yeah, so that kind of, the online format seems to streamline that.
Yeah, I mean, and to that point, you know, when I was working in oils, it was always a mad dash when I finished it, that I'd have to build like a crate, because it was usually wet, and I would build a crate out of cardboard so that it wouldn't touch the surface of the painting, and I would have to rush to FedEx to overnight it to the client, because it was rare that I would finish it early.
Yeah.
And it was kind of like this weird adrenaline, but it was also just really, really annoying. I mean, the thing is that I tell my students all the time is just to draw all the time.
Yeah.
And, you know, be influenced by things other than just illustration or things other than just comics. You know, read, watch films, listen to music, pay attention to the world around you. And you know, don't think that, you know, illustrators tend to think I've got to have a style that has a hook that people identify as mine and me, and oftentimes that's all they draw, or that's the only kind of drawing that they do. Whereas that just makes things, I think, it's too limiting. And I think, you know, doing things that, I mean, like I work in Photoshop now, and I work with these sort of flat, somewhat flat colors, but like occasionally do an oil painting, or occasionally draw in a different medium, and, you know, do an observational drawing.
Yeah.
You know, I read books, pay attention to the world around you, and let that influence what you're doing.
Yeah.
You know, don't have a narrow field of focus.